Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Butler at Faith Trust Institute. We want to thank you for joining us for our Meaningful Voices Book Club this evening. We're delighted you're here. We'll get started in just a second, but first some technical information. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check that your speaker or headset is plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in the email, and then reconnect again, because that usually fixes the problems. All audience members are muted, but we do want to hear from you. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me at any time using the question feature on the right side of your screen. If you don't see the question box, you can see the little orange arrow probably in the top right corner. You click on that and that will open up more options for you. So we're going to get started, and we're delighted you're here. Today, our presenters are going to be Elena Giacci, Katie Zay, and Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. So, everybody, go.
Hello, good evening. It's Marie Fortune here, and welcome again to our book club. And I am the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. I'm a pastor in the United Church of Christ. And my particular interest in the book club that we're doing is when we encounter either fiction or nonfiction that where we find an intersection between violence against women and religion, which is frequent, unfortunately. So I want to invite my two colleagues, Elena and Katie, to introduce themselves. Elena, would you go first?
Sure. My name is Elena Giacci, and I come from the Diné Nation, and I'm an antisexual and domestic violence trainer and advocate for American Indian and Alaska Native people. I've been doing that for over 28 years. And I have experience in the violence against women field. I'm currently the chair of the Albuquerque Mayor's Anti-Domestic and Sexual Violence Task Force. I am the faculty leader for the Limited English Proficiency Plan with the Albuquerque Police Department, and I am the facilitator for diversity training for our Albuquerque Police Department, our cadets, and our long-term officers. I've also had the privilege of working with Dr. Elizabeth Miller in a research study just recently with the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, Partner Violence and Reproductive Coercion among Native American women. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for joining us. And Katie, please.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Katie Zay, and I am a strategist, writer, and speaker focused at the intersections of faith and gender justice, and I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm currently in the ordination process to become a Baptist minister in the Alliance of Baptist Tradition, and I serve as chair of the board for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in Washington, D.C. I'm the co-host of a podcast called Kindreds, where we look at topics related to faith and feminism. And I'm also the author of a forthcoming book called Women Rise Up at the Intersections of the Bible and Women Resisting Oppression. I'm really glad to be here.
Super. And we'll, I think, reference your upcoming publication, Katie, at the end so people can follow up on that. So, okay, so let's get started. We're talking about The Handmaid's Tale tonight by Margaret Atwood. And I wanted to first start with the observation that as I was rereading this book and also watching the Hulu version, which I hope those of you who are joining us have had access to. But part of what I was reflecting on is the context of reading this book. And the book was published in 1985. I first read it in 1987, and thinking back to that period, and for me, and I think probably for Elena, sort of that point in our work on these issues, And then what difference does it make if people are just reading it now? Katie, I'd like you to comment on, when you first read it and sort of where you were in your development and awareness. But I remember particularly being quite disturbed by it and also enlightened in a painful but positive way. But it's one of those books that, having read it at that point, has always haunted me. So I'm curious now what difference it makes as it's come back into our sort of cultural awareness in North America. And so, Elena, would you speak to that for your experience of it?
Yeah, because I was telling Marie that the very first time I began to read it was probably in 1990 and then 91, and then I think I actually finished it in 1992. And part of that was the elimination, complete elimination of race in the book. And so, that was a pretty big wall for me to decide to go over just to say I want to read this book. I think it was Diné Dodson said how often we as women of color are in the blank spaces, and I think that was very much how this operated, and it's probably why I really didn't pursue reading it wholeheartedly until Marie said, I'd like you to be a part of this. But I still get torqued because of the elimination. And, there could have been, if you're looking at a dystopia, the idea is that maybe talking about that, but I really think it's a reflection of Margaret Atwood and her understanding of people of color.
Yeah, and part of the story is the fact that people of color were not part of the segment that she's writing about, which is the patriarchal narrative that she creates, which was white men in charge, and so
right.
It's part of the narrative, but your point is important in terms of part of the narrative is that people of color were simply eliminated from the narrative that she draws for us. So
right. And I think that's incredibly important because I also think it says, would people have reacted the same way around this issue had it just been people of color, or would they have reacted differently now that these are all, non-native women, white women? So just a question.
Yeah. So Katie, say a little bit about where you came into this discussion.
I was born in 1983. So I did not read this book until my until I could read. It was not my first book.
Baby.
Right.
But I remember reading it. I remember reading it on a plane from North Carolina to Washington, D.C. So that means it must have been within the last 7 or 8 years. And I remember at that time, the contraceptive mandate had been part of the public conversation with the Obama administration. And we had the whole Sandra Fluck, the Georgetown law student who testified about the need for contraception for women. And we had the backlash against her, calling her and all the people who need birth control sluts, which very much mirrors the language in The Handmaid's Tale and the way that women who use birth control are talked about. And I was also studying the history of reproductive justice, which is a women of color, mostly African-American women, who developed this whole paradigm in response to the movement for abortion access, saying that we can't just focus on that issue. It's got to be about who's allowed to parent and how, and raising my own consciousness about forced sterilization and really the control of Black women's bodies and their inability to procreate. And so one of the things that came up for me in rereading this book is that who is allowed to parent? It's white, wealthy men who have power. Those are the people who are allowed to be parents. It's not just up to biology. It's really very much controlled. And so we were talking earlier about reproductive coercion and oppression, and that's really what came to light for me in rereading it again, with having studied a bit more the history of reproductive oppression against Black women, especially in the U.S.
And let's not gloss over the fact that in the book, it is white men are in charge, but it is also white privileged women who are parenting, who have the option, the access to children that other people bear, but that they then raise. So that, that's part of the whole picture. Elena?
Yeah, I was just going to, speaking of forced sterilization, I mean, we know from the 1971 to probably around 1977 that IHS, which is a government entity, utilized really significant sterilization processes for Native women. And so that's a part, unfortunately, of our history. And, Katie, when you were talking about who gets to be the parent, because I think that's also, we end up having a lot of our Native children taken away from us and not ever returned. And so I think those are all pieces as well. And we still have very few facilities on Native reservation and have very few facilities that allow things like Plan B and things of that sort without cameras in the pharmacy itself.
And to remind people what IHS is.
IHS is the medical organization that is supposed to, from the get-go, from the time that it was created, to look out for Native people and their health and well-being medically and things like that. And unfortunately, they're getting much better, so I want to say that, but they have had a very poor history of taking care of the Native people, and that happened with IHS. So it wasn't like a strange organization or a different organization. That happened within IHS itself.
Right. I want to just call our attention to, again, in terms of context here, and we're going to go further into some of those issues that both of you have raised, but in terms of context, I was really struck on page 164 when the lead character here, Offred, at the end of that chapter says, wherever you may be, can you hear me? You wanted she's speaking to her mother. You wanted a women's culture. Well, now there is one. It isn't what you meant, but it exists. Be thankful for small mercies. So she's really lifting up the, I guess we could say, irony or contradiction of the fact that this oppressive government has created a particular kind of women's culture in which women are not allowed to read, to have money, to have property, to move about, but are, identified and as being women in a particular role in several different settings. but it wasn't what her mother meant. And I'm assuming here she's talking about her mother as someone who was involved in activism prior to the coup that created the oppressive government. But I thought that summary of women's culture, but gone totally wrong, gone totally not what any of us would have anticipated, as she's trying to describe the normative nature now of this oppressive government and the impact on our culture. And then on page 74, she seems to be reflecting on what she remembers from before all this happened, because she's old enough to, remember and experience that. And here she says, "Is that how we lived then? But we lived as usual. Everyone does most of the time. Whatever is going on is as usual, even as this is usual now. We lived as usual by ignoring. Ignoring isn't the same as ignorance. You have to work at it." And I think in terms of our contemporary context, which the slide lifts up, the sort of the comparison between the moral majority in '85 and where we are now. And Elena, one of the things you and I were talking about earlier was, are we living, is Atwood describing a dystopic future or something much more historic? And I wanted you to speak to that.
Yeah, because I do think that I would have less issue when you start looking at some of the dystopia in being so dysfunctional, understanding and realizing of how this circle goes, so that we walk into this pit and it's very much a pit that hurts women. And then we come out of that pit because people are activists, and then we get comfortable, and then we forget, and then it does it again. And I think very much that this speaks to that dystopia, is that we start seeing people hurt, we start disagreeing, but the power is still with the white males who have had the power and who are not going to give that up easily.
Right. And I think raising the question that you were raising that I hadn't thought of before, of, is this merely a description of a dystopic future, or is it also a description of a dystopic past? In terms of, Atwood says, there's nothing in this book that hasn't already happened or isn't happening now in real life. This is not science fiction. She's not creating a fantasy about how women are mistreated.
Right. And especially when you look at the religious overtones and the destruction in the name of religion, and how many times that was brought up, because it was in the name of religion, we find that this is what we need to do.
Yeah,
right.
The justification. Go ahead, Katie.
The forced surrogacy is a theme that we see throughout the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, it's used as one of the stories, that they're quoting for the whole ritualized rape of Rachel not being able to get pregnant and using her slaves, forcing them into marriage with Jacob. And we see that with Sarai and Hagar and Abram in Genesis. And I think that when those texts come up in certain faith communities and certain Christian communities, there is this impulse to excuse it away and say, well, that was just the culture, instead of dealing with the violence and how forced surrogacy in different forms still exists today. I would argue that there are a lot of women who, don't have any other way to make a living other than to become surrogates for people who can't get pregnant. So is that the same if women can't otherwise live and support their families unless they use their bodies to, to gestate someone else's child? So in that way, I completely agree that these are ancient and contemporary issues.
Mm-hmm. And then certainly the history of children being taken away. And Elena, your observation about that on the reservations and how children were basically taken away by often church groups who were missionaries to the reservations. That was part of the pattern of taking children and to raise them as Christians. It's sort of, what's the difference here? Is there really a difference?
Well, and the churches were the big motivator to have residential schools, and the idea behind the residential schools was to create and have Native people assimilate white culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at the dystopia that kind of came about in Handmaid's Tale, you're still looking at the idea of white culture being put out there as the way to operate our world, our country, our neighborhoods. And so, and that's how it played out there too, was this is the people who have power and money get to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that the dominant culture's expectation of normative, we're back to, what is normative, and preferred. And so that there are a number of places in the world where indigenous children had that experience, often due to Christian missionaries' activities. And that's only sadly becoming more apparent and coming to light at this, late 20th century and into now. But I was really called to look at that in terms of what's the difference between that and what Atwood is describing in terms of the women who are handmaids, who basically bear a child and then the child is immediately removed.
Right.
And given to somebody else. Yeah. So the issue of religion and the misuse of religion is a common theme here. But I think it was also in some ways for me a puzzling theme of the propaganda use of it, like around the forced surrogacy and the citing of Hebrew scripture to explain, justify, affirm that activity that these women were required to do. But I was also struck by the description that the Bible itself was locked up. And I think she uses the word incendiary. Because it was incendiary, it was not available. Plus, women were not allowed to read. And so, of course, we know that only takes one generation to lose literacy from ordinary people. So if it was an incendiary thing, then why did the powers that be not want people to have access to this book that supposedly is the source of all of the framework, the ideology that surrounded the whole project of Gilead? Do y'all have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was just thinking about kind of the more the more evangelical community in which I grew up, and we were encouraged to read the Bible, but in some ways it's not that different because certain texts, certain passages were lifted up as more authoritative, and we were taught to interpret them all in a certain way. So even though there was access, I still feel like the Bible was locked up in the sense that certain understandings of Scripture and what we know about the history of how the Bible was put together was kept from those of us who were in the congregation. And so I wouldn't say it was as extreme, but I think when you have white men in authority telling you how to read Scripture, it's almost as if you don't have access to it at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, and I would agree that when you look at keeping things hidden, I think that's always a key to ensuring that nobody can check the stats and checks. And if you keep things hidden, then they have to take your word for it, and that's the way it is. So, and I think that's gone on for a very long time, because I know in the Catholic religion it was like, here's the Scripture, here's this, and then this is the way it's going to be interpreted. And you didn't have a lot of wiggle room in how to interpret. It was interpreted by the priest, and that meant that's the way it was going to be. And I see that in this book all the time, is we are going to interpret it a certain way, and that's what you will listen to.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and if you're not encouraged to be educated within whatever faith tradition you're part of, educated about the tradition and sort of the broader understanding of the nature of the tradition, then that's all you get is that narrow slice. And so what we end up with, I think, in Handmaid's Tale is primarily religion as propaganda. So that's the quote here that we have on the screen is the scene at lunch where the Beatitudes were read and the handmaids were forced to simply listen. And then we see a portion of the Beatitudes, blessed are this, blessed are that, blessed are the merciful, the meek, blessed are the silent. And then Alfred's comment is, I knew they made that up. I knew it was wrong, and they left things out too. So somewhere in her background, she had had some exposure to that passage in order for her to hear it and go, wait a minute, that's not even what the text says. But she couldn't do anything about that, because here were the Beatitudes being basically used to explain to the handmaids why you're in this situation and why you should appreciate it and accept it and end the discussion.
And I find it really interesting that those damn Beatitudes are still being used against women who put their faith in that Bible, and they're like, but it says here, and it's like, yeah, but let's take a look at that. And so, but it's still very much being used as the reason that they can do those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Right. In terms of justification and normalizing. So, well, of course it must be okay because, this is, the Bible says. Folks that basically start from that premise. And I never cease to be amazed whenever I would be speaking with a woman who had been abused in the home, that she would be saying all these things to me, and I was like, what Bible did they read to you, and what preacher did you hear that said this to you? and it was always very disturbing because, you know, that wasn't my understanding as a person of faith, but clearly that's what the message had been in order to usually silence and justify the treatment that she had experienced.
Yeah, and I've had a number of discussions. The older priests are still very problematic, but the newer priests are a little bit better, but they still quote that Beatitudes to women all the time. And that's not the only thing they utilize against someone to be able to manipulate their power.
Yeah, and I think it's been one of the important contributions of feminist and womenist theology and biblical studies to be able to even ask the question of whom is being addressed, okay, in a text like this, and how do we hear it differently depending on who we are and what our social location is. That there's a very different significance depending on those factors. But those questions were never even asked before.
Right. And I think that goes back to just the idea of throwing back the question and saying, because I was always amazed when you had given all of these little quotes and stuff like that, where it was like, who's really talking, what they really said, you know. And we're talking priests and our bishops who don't go that far back, but just take something out of context. And I think it shows that how much problems occur when things are so taken out of context or people don't have access to read it, because you see that the whole time. They don't have, you know, all of the women don't have the power because they have nothing to fight it with.
Which is really what you're raising is the issue of authority within any faith tradition. Who has the authority to say, that's not what this means? Or, you know, I've experienced it in a pastoral context where I've literally said to someone, that's not what God wants for you. Now, if they feel like I have the authority to say that, then that may be helpful to them. But how do we find our authority in our voice, particularly with alternative interpretations, to be able to say, no, that's really not what this is about. If that's, you know, our concern or where our scholarship has led. But that's what we need more of is people who have that sense of authority, who can step up and say, wait a minute, you know, this is not. And it's like in the Beatitudes sections when Offred says the issue of blessed are the silent, I knew they had made that up. So she's going with her sense of authority to say, wait a minute, no, that wasn't ever in there.
Right.
You know.
Right. And if you don't have access and you don't have the power to check out the things, then you can't call people on it.
Right. Right.
You know.
Right.
And until you came into my life, did I even know how to call people on it? It was like, oh, yeah, you big liar. And it was like, no, that's not what he meant. And I mean, then I got a little bit more educated so that no wasn't my final response. So,
right. Having the words that you need to speak back to the thing that feels untrue. And like I said before, I grew up in a very evangelical community. And I remember the first time I heard another woman say that women shouldn't be ordained, and I knew in my gut that was wrong, but I didn't have the words that I needed. Hadn't studied. I hadn't heard I just knew it was wrong, but I felt like in that debate, I wasn't equipped. And when you talk about authority, what I'm trying to do in my book is give women the ability to explore the texts in depth, ask their own questions, disagree with what I'm saying. And because to me, authority is about exploration and really entertaining different ideas about what a text could mean. And without access to it, as you both have said, you don't have that ability to have your creativity and your imagination at play working with the text. It's just without access, you're completely cut off from that ability to imagine what could be actually going on or how it could apply.
And now you can then affirm your experience as one source of authority, which is what's been denied women, I think, historically, is our experience is not part of the discussion. So, how do we go back and recover that as one of the sources that then begins to inform how we read text or how we interpret the history of a faith tradition or what have you. So we've got a couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. I was just seeing these.
Okay, so actually Lucille writes in, and one of the questions that she asks is about the threat of technology and extremists in power and the kind of fake news of everything. So that there is no authority on anything, but it's not that you don't have access to information. There's just so much information. So one of the things that the book doesn't really take on is the technological issues that we're now facing, which put a different spin on things. So
yeah, it's like that was then. That was 1985. That was before the current technology that we have before us. So how does this play now? And I'm sure if even Atwood wrote this novel now, it would be very different in terms of how those factors play into it. But that's a really interesting question around fake news and the question of authority around anything, but particularly I think religious authority. So Katie, do you have other thoughts? Yeah,
I do. I mean, I think that there's a parallel that can be made because part of what's going on in The Handmaid's Tale is a lack of conversation too among the handmaids. They're not really allowed to speak with each other, and I think some of what's happening, especially online, is we're so polarized that we're not really able to converse with each other than spitting back talking points or getting into our echo chambers, or we're only hearing from people who agree with us. So in that way, I think there's a similar kind of cutoff of meaningful, difficult conversations in which we can have respectful disagreement with each other. So in that way, that might be a parallel to what's happening in the book.
But how do you feel about the impact of both the anti-science dimension of our contemporary experiences, but also the intentional distribution of fake news and fake information that becomes part of the discourse that we can have?
Yeah, it's almost like similar to the biblical proof texting. I mean, I think that's what Atwood does such a good job of, is showing the satire of what proof texting can mean, especially the scene of the ritualized rape, and there's this literal, like, the wife has to be behind the handmaid. And so to me, that shows some of the absurdity of what lengths we'll go to reinforce our own understanding, our desired way of understanding the world. And I would say the construction of fake news is very similar. Like, we want to have a certain worldview, and so we will construct a narrative that feeds into that because that's what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And I think that we have always done that, just not as succinctly. I think that forever and a day we have created we know our history is not what really happened. And we know that a lot of things, and people choose to decide whether or not they are going to take that history and say this is the real thing, or look into it more and find out about that. We have the opportunity. It's like good news, bad news. Good news is we have a crap load of everything out there. Bad news is we have a crap load of stuff out there. So that we can't help but have to be the weeders of the truth. And you know, I think that's the piece, is how do you weed the truth? And then who gets to do that? And when people in power, like in The Handmaid's Tale, have decided this is the truth, then nothing else, it doesn't matter what everything else is. It wouldn't matter if she had received that information, because it would not matter, because she's not supported. So she can have that truth. But if you're not supported in that way, then, you know, we let things end up getting pretty crazy. And I think that's with fake news. And I'm always amazed at fake news.
Right. Yeah, so the isolation that in the book Offred experiences, even though she's still in touch with and recalling things from before in her experience, and raising those questions, but she has no one to raise them with. So she's making her notes to herself, and she knows there are other people, but she can't connect with them because the institutional structure that's been created is intentionally separating women from each other, activists from the folks in the colonies or wherever it is they've been sent and so forth, who are part of the resistance. It's not an accident. It's simply part of the plan to make sure that people don't connect those stories, those experiences and resources to be able to then be empowered to do that. I want to make one other comment about the religion before we go to the race discussion. I was intrigued by the fact that there was no, at least in the description, there was no participation, even by the powers that be, in the church as church. And at one point, the handmaids are walking past a building, and I think one of them comments, or Offred just makes the observation that used to be a church and now it's a museum. So the fact that there seems to be no functioning faith community of whatever description, I was just intrigued by it. It's like, so we've got all of this, you know, the propaganda, the justification, the language, the names, and so forth that hold up this whole system, but it looks like the church has been banned, and how that is, and the Bible's been banned, and so forth. So did either of you have any thoughts about that or react to that?
I didn't really think about it until you brought it up in our conversation. And similarly, the religious folks that we see are dead. They've been hanged on the wall. So we don't even see kind of religious authority figures in that way either throughout. And I think we should also mention that they also, you know, remove all of the Jewish folks who won't convert and send them back to Israel. I mean, there's these extreme measures to kind of completely extricate anything that doesn't fall into this very, you know, narrow understanding of Christianity, if you could even call it that. But yeah, there is almost this elimination of religion altogether, which is something I had not considered until you raised it.
Yeah, but it's one of those sort of ironies of, wait a minute. Even for those of us who are still part of faith traditions like the church and struggling with the pluses and minuses of those institutions, but the notion that they would be completely eliminated clearly means that they are problematic to the structures. And so, okay, what's behind that? And likewise, the elimination of access to the Bible, which at least in terms of my reading, it was one of the reasons that in U.S. history, slaves were not allowed to read. Well, A, to read, and B, to read the Bible. But somehow they got access to those stories, and those stories then became a significant part of their understanding of Exodus and liberation and so forth that supported their empowerment. So it's just as interesting. It's one of those things I'd love to talk to Atwood about in terms of what she was thinking. So let's go ahead and look specifically at race. One of the, Elena, you raised this at the beginning in terms of the absence of people of color basically in the book, and the explanation that they've all been sent to the colonies or wherever to do the dirty work of cleaning up the toxic waste.
Right.
But in the Hulu version, we see people of color appear. And so there's been discussion back and forth about that as a decision that the producers made. So what's your take on that, each of you?
Well, I mean, for me, they knew how well one more all-white show would go over, and especially something like this. So I do think that they did it to appease the viewers of Hulu, and for no other reason than that, because I don't think the insertion of color really, I mean, it was like, well, we'll make this person, you know, a black person so that it'll be more accepted because it would come off pretty ugly. But I thought that it was very interesting that they did that with the Hulu version. I find it fascinating that they add people of color into that. And not all people of color, only African American people of color.
Yeah, it appears to be. It's not totally clear, but it appears to be that. Katie, do you have any thoughts on that production decision on the part of the folks who made the movie?
I think similar to Elena, I mean, there's the inclusion of African American actors in the cast, but the issue of race is never dealt with. So, you know, it's hard to say that it's significant because it's just never dealt with. You know, there's the Samira Wiley is, you know, one of the main characters who's was in Orange is the New Black. So I think a lot of name recognition. She's also an amazing actor, and I imagine that she tested for it and they said, we have to have you. And it probably didn't matter to them because race was not going to be an issue in the show.
Right.
But it's also interesting that Elizabeth Moss is married to an African-American man and they have a biracial child. So that was kind of interesting to think about. Okay, so that child was still taken and was still considered desirable. So you see that kind of like, it will take, basically the ruling class will take any child that's available to them. That's how few children there are. But just the fact that they never deal with it in any way, shape, or form, never name it, is just odd. It was kind of a it's uncomfortable, I think, to watch it with everything else being so explicit and then never paying attention to race.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you look at the time that it actually came out and all the things that were going on as far as civil rights and, you know, components like that. And when you start taking a look at those pieces, you just sit there and want, you know, is it expected? Absolutely. Every time it happens, it makes me angry. And, you know, we just literally get eliminated like we didn't exist. And like, and they don't deal with race at all. And it's a dystopia. So I would think of all the times that you would deal with race would be in a dystopia because of how dysfunctional it is.
Mm-hmm. And none of the commanders are people of color. And none of the commanders' wives are people of color. So there's certainly implicit messages going on in the show about race.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of the point. So that even the inclusion of the characters in terms of Offred's husband and their prior life, and handmaids who were women of color. I think you're right that seeing that now in this production is partly a reflection of our contemporary culture expecting to see some diversity in the characters as normative. But in terms of the story, it's contradictory in some ways, particularly I think around the forced surrogacy and so forth, because the history of miscegenation in this country and the legal history of trying to prevent persons of different races from marrying and from bearing children, is a huge part of American history. So the fact that that would be a normative either speaks to the fact that in Gilead the need for childbearing was so severe, which goes back, I think, to Katie, your point that that any child was highly valued because so few people could have children. That makes sense to me, but otherwise, I think in terms of the ideology of Gilead, it doesn't make sense to me. It makes more sense to me, and not for good reasons, that people of color don't appear because of racism, not because there's not an issue to discuss there as to, well, why don't they appear? Where are they? What are they doing? What happened to them? What did it take for that to be created? But I do think it raised additional issues in the production that are kind of interesting to unpack, as it were. But
yeah. There's so much more to say about that. It really is. You could spend an entire hour just talking about how that got treated.
Yeah.
And it was like they thought somehow that pandering to this audience that knew full well that race wasn't ever dealt with, and then putting African Americans in there and treating them just as if they are white people and not making any kind of difference or change or culture or anything that has anything to do with it, but just acknowledge that there are African American people in there. It just it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense.
Without some discussion of or addressing of the fact.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. What about in again thinking about Gilead not just as a dystopian future, but also our history? The whole model of slavery in the United States as a reflection of, how the whole system worked, or works in terms of of Gilead, particularly around the surrogacy issue and children being taken from their mothers, sold, separate, the whole separation, the value that was placed on women as breeders, as part of the value and slavery of women as commodities, men as commodities, to be bought and sold and so forth.
Well, I mean, I think the extreme that's happening in this culture is that infertility and stillbirth are so high that they don't subject the handmaids to physical labor because they're controlling their bodies in other ways. So I think that that's maybe a difference that we should think about, is they're really kind of like put up on a pedestal in one sense, and then completely mutilated in another sense. But I think seeing the value of women as completely tied to their reproduction and their ability to produce children. Another thing that I wanted to mention that they downplay in the series, that they don't in the book, is that the birth of a girl infant is kind of, a sad occasion in the book, that they're like, oh, it's a girl, it's too bad. Whereas in the series, they don't really play into the gender of the baby that's born. So I think that kind of connects back to the biblical narrative too, of girls just being worthless. So what you really want is a boy to continue your lineage. So in that way, I see a connection like all the way back to kind of the biblical narrative too. And your only worth as a woman is who you're married to and who you can give a male heir to.
And yet there's again some irony in that in Gilead, given that the value of women in order to reproduce was significant. So why don't they celebrate the birth of female children in that regard? But you're right, it goes back to the patriarchal value of, male gender and so forth as preferred in the birth of a child.
Right, because they need a future commander. They need a future commander to take the place of the white man in power.
You mean more than they need handmaids?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, the birth of a woman into the ruling class doesn't have the same significance as a boy born into the ruling class.
Mm-hmm. But that becomes an interesting question that we really don't see in the book or the movie, is those children who become who are then parented by the ruling class, what happens to them?
Right, there aren't any teenagers in the series that I remember. Most of the kids are young, so it seems like Gilead must be fairly new. This whole culture must be fairly new. But yeah, where are all the teenagers? That would be a good question to ask. Or maybe they're being prepared. I mean, there's a scene in the book that we have not yet seen in the series of like the young girls being married off at age 14. So I guess that answers that question, is maybe they're trying to have girls give birth at an early age.
But married off to privileged men.
Yeah, well, it's like the warriors from the war are marrying these young girls.
Yes, that's right. That's their reward.
That's the reward.
Yeah. Okay. Elena, do you have any other thoughts around that?
Nope, but I did have a question.
Okay.
Basically looking at how religion is portrayed and all of the mores and negative things around religion, and both of you being a part of that, how do you think that, I mean, what does it make you feel when you see things like this, or like the series and read the book? I mean, how does it make you feel?
About being part of a faith community?
Being part of the faith community, but looking at how this particular piece was portrayed, as well as the types of things that faith communities have done that has been, you know, historic in nature, as well as just looking at how it was portrayed, how religion was portrayed, and in the name of that, and had just, you know, what are your feelings around that?
Go ahead, Katie. You start.
You go, Katie.
You know, I'm pretty stubbornly committed to being part of a faith community so that I can be someone who bridges with folks who, you know, have been completely turned off from participating, especially in Christian communities, because of what they've seen like this, which is really typical among people my age. So for me to be someone who kind of straddles that generation, who also participates in a progressive faith community, who can use faith language to present an alternative understanding of what it means to be a person of faith, is really important to me. So when I read a book like this, I'm like, yeah, I see. I mean, I've seen folks who do this. You know, I grew up in a proof texting kind of community, and have learned a new way. And so I think it makes me even more committed to the work of being a person of faith who engages in meaningful conversation, who asks the tough questions, who advocates for reproductive health and rights because of my faith and not in spite of it. So I think for me, it just solidifies the call that I feel to be that kind of person, because it's still, I got an email today from someone I went to college with, I just recently reconnected with, who had read some of my writing, and she said, I'm so glad to know that you exist, that you hold these viewpoints, that you consider yourself a Christian. I don't know anyone who, like, I feel so isolated, like the Handmaid. I feel so isolated as someone who holds these political views and also identifies as a Christian. So in that way, I know that I have to put myself out there and take the risk to present some views that not everybody's going to agree with, so that I can make connections with people who also feel the same way, who might not know other people like them exist.
Right. Yeah, I think for me, Elena, in response to your question, I mean, the first time I read this and then seeing the production and rereading it, at every point, I'm infuriated and disturbed and frightened and you know, that whole range of feelings, because I know the power of religion in terms of it's being misused. And what I describe, that I hear in the story and that I see in contemporary expressions, the kind of thing that Katie's talking about, is religion in service to patriarchy. So the question is, what does patriarchy need in order to be patriarchy and to stay in place? And that's when, you know, patriarchy turns to religion as a resource to justify and prop up the kind of values that the ideology of patriarchy promotes. So for me, as a person of faith and who comes from a family and a faith tradition in which that was an important part of my development and formation and my awareness and commitment to social justice, when I see that being misused in ways that are so horribly oppressive to people and historically have been, it's a profound contradiction that I take very personally. So I'm much like Katie in terms of my commitment, because it is part of who I am, is to stay there to correct that, to change that, to deny the power of the misuse of religion to cause this kind of harm to people. And I feel like that's something that those of us who come out of those traditions have the capacity to do. But I also want to be clear that I don't expect that everyone makes that choice or feels that call to stay in those settings and do that work. You know, we have to do our work wherever it is so we can be effective, and we feel called to do it. But it has a significant emotional as well as intellectual impact to read something like this and to know it's true, and to know, as you have often reminded me, that it is historically true, both in terms of the violence against women, but also the role of faith and the role of the church community. And so my job is to deal with, you know, what do I do about that, knowing that and facing that. So, but I appreciate the question. So.
Yeah, good answer.
So I want to take us to a conclusion here in terms of another piece of this that I found particularly interesting on my second reading here was the way in which the ideology told women that the way things used to be was bad for women, particularly in terms of violence against women. And there's several points where this is described, kind of like in the old days, and this is one of them on the screen right now. So that the explanation that then women weren't protected, the rules were something that women knew. You can't do this, you can't do that, you shouldn't go here, you shouldn't go there. It's kind of all the same things that we've all heard various versions of in our own growing up and in our own experiences. And now that this new system protects women from that. So here the conclusion from Aunt Lydia: in the days of anarchy, it was freedom to, and now you are being given freedom from. Don't underrate it. So supposedly, I mean, this is, again, the contradiction is astonishing. This is supposedly protection from violence against women in a system that perpetuates violence against women. And it's like, you know, your head explodes in the midst of this. But I'm wondering how either or both of you heard that or read that in the story itself.
Well, in neither case are they dealing with the male participation in patriarchy that leads to the culture of violence. So
Right.
it's just manifested itself in a different form. And I was also thinking, I don't think Aunt Lydia knows about the Jezebels and what's going on. You know, like what does she know? What do the aunts know? Who teaches them what's going on? What kind of propaganda did they go through to be in those positions? But the similarity to me is that it's still the patriarchy, and we haven't dealt with the issue of male control of women's bodies. It's just a different way of controlling them.
And I completely agree with that, because until we start really taking a hard look at all of those components that are being brought up in this book, it really ends up being one of the saddest parts of our continued future, is having that power being taken away from our bodies and not having a say-so over them. And we see it happen more and more and more and more.
Uh-huh. And part of what we see portrayed here that's challenging is the role of women in promoting and sustaining this model. So whether it's the aunts, the wives, whoever's doing the propaganda and so forth, and explaining to the handmaids, at least, how much better off they are than they used to be. And it's shrouded under a suggestion of choice, that you have a choice. And on page 121, Offred is saying, she's talking about the commander and her relationship with him. I do not say making love because it's not what he's doing. Copulating two would be too inaccurate because it would imply two people and only one is involved. Nor does rape cover it. Nothing is going on here that I haven't signed up for that wasn't a lot of choice, but there was some. There wasn't a lot of choice, but there was some, and this is what I choose. So that whole, and I assume she's saying that in the sense of I chose this rather than being sent to the colonies, which is the non-choice that women have faced historically and contemporarily, of no real choice about whether it's control over our bodies or our relationships or where we go or where, when we go there and so forth and so on. So it's that illusion of choice that, again, it makes your head explode. And that other women are enforcing that. So when I read about, go ahead, Elena.
It's a real tough one because we see that with those women who get paid for their services, and they often will say, "This is my choice." Mm-hmm. But then when you stop and really speak to them, it's like it's very much like The Handmaid's Tale. The choices are limited, so their choice is to do A or B, and so just because you make one of those may not necessarily be a choice. And it's a hard one because we do have a lot of people who say, I'm in the entertainment industry, this is what I do, it pays money, and this is my choice. And so women have to kind of support that. But then there's the flip side of how much of a choice is it?
Uh-huh.
What do you think, Katie?
Well, I was thinking about it in the context of reproductive decision making, and this is a critique of the label pro-choice, because in many cases it's not, women really don't have the ability to freely decide what to do about about a pregnancy when all of the options available are problematic in different ways. So it's making, in many ways, like the protagonist of this story of like, what decision do I make when all of the available options are going to hurt me in some way. So I really struggled with that line where she said, I can't call it rape. I didn't remember that from the book, and like that she is, I mean, it's just such good writing. But the kind of like so she's saying, I'm not quite consenting, but I kind of am because I signed up for this, or I agreed to do this. That was a really, that passage really has stuck with me since I reread it. Because when I see those, and I see the scenes in the series especially, it's definitely a rape scene. You don't get that narrative that's in the book in the series. And I just thought, wow, what a complex sort of inner story she's crafting in her own mind about what's happening to her. And sort of this, like the victim blaming that's going on within her of, well, I chose this, so I can't really fault anyone for what's happening to me. It's heartbreaking.
But again, not unusual in that, you know, so for, I mean, it's part of the struggle that many survivors deal with around, well, I was hitchhiking, I was at the bar, I was drinking, I was this, I was that, therefore. And, you know, everything around them, everyone around them is reinforcing that whatever you were doing caused this to happen to you. And so it's another version of that, I think. A version that Atwood is putting out there for us. But very, it's so painful. It's so painful to hear each other do that, and to then be able to say, wait a minute, because it's so drummed into women that this is why, that it's very hard to step outside of that and say, wait a minute, you know, let's look at this again in terms of, you know, your moral agency, other people's moral agency, and back to your point, Katie, where was the male perpetrator in the whole story? And very rarely appears as that. So I wanted to conclude us, but I just want to see, is there anything either of you want to draw us to here as we draw the conversation to an end? Anything you've thought about?
Well, let's see. We've talked about race and reproductive coercion and religion. I think we did a good job for the night.
Is that all we can handle tonight?
I know. I think I started getting beads of sweat on my head. So, but it's been an honor and privilege to be part of this, and also have people listen to the conversation. So I thank everybody who's joined us, and it's been an honor and privilege to be with both Katie and Marie.
And thank you, Elena, for taking the time to do that. And Katie, any closing thoughts?
I would just echo what Elena said. I always learn best in conversation with thoughtful women, mostly, not exclusively. So just having a chance to process something that I thought I had thought about a lot made me realize how many issues I hadn't really thought about as I was rereading the book. So it's been enriching for me, and I know will be for other people too who are watching now and who will be watching this later. So thank you also for the opportunity to talk about this really important and timely book.
Good. Yeah, and likewise for me. It's always, that's why I enjoy doing the book club. I'm always learning so much in the conversations that we have. But I want to conclude before I pass back to Sarah about next things and so forth. And just the FYI on the screen, there are two things going on that we discovered, the Handmaid Coalition and Handmaid's Resistance, in terms of organizing around all the issues we're dealing with and trying to use some of the imagery from the production to draw attention to those issues. So you might want to pursue those and check those out. But there's a segment in Atwood's book, begins on page 173 in my version, which was the 1985 version that I still had on my shelf, which I was pleased to be able to find it when I needed to reread it. But I had marked this when I read it in 1985, and I came to it again and was particularly taken by it. It's a paragraph, but I do want to read it because I think she puts her finger on something so important. She says, it's impossible to say a thing exactly the way it was because what you say can never be exact. You can always have to leave something out. There are too many parts, sides, cross currents, nuances, too many gestures, which could mean this or that, too many shapes, which can never be fully described, too many flavors in the air or on the tongue, half colors, too many. But if you happen to be a man sometime in the future and you've made it this far, please remember, you will never be subject to the temptation or feeling you must forgive you, a man, as a woman. It's difficult to resist, believe me, but remember that forgiveness too is a power. To beg for it is a power, and to withhold it or bestow it is a power, perhaps the greatest. Maybe none of this is about control. Maybe it isn't really about who can own whom, who can do what to whom, and get away with it. Maybe it's about who can do what to whom and be forgiven for it. But never tell me it amounts to the same thing. So that's a challenge I think Atwood leaves us in this novel that she has given us. So I will pass it back to Sarah to conclude.
Okay, so we just have a last question here that you might all want to put some words to. So Kelsey says, we're at a point in history where women are fighting for rights we thought we already won. Do you have any action items for women to take now to make sure we don't head down a road that leads to oppression like we see in the book? So anyone have some words of advice or wisdom to share before we close up here?
Get involved. Get involved. Stand in those front lines. Because sometimes it's really lonely standing in that front and nobody having your back. And so places like, you know, the Reproductive Choice and the Religious Coalition, you know, having your back and doing those kinds of things that, and it's incredibly important, even if it's just one person that you make that difference in. You have made a difference. And never forget that. Never forget the act of one and what that can do.
I love connecting people. So if you're someone who really is looking for what you can do, I would love to chat with you one-on-one over email, and I will connect you with the folks that I know who are doing this work. So I don't know if there's a place for us to share our contact information or if that's going to be shared on the slideshow, but I would offer that personally, that this is one of my spiritual gifts. So I would love to help you connect to the right group of folks who are organizing.
Excellent. And let me just respond to that question somewhat personally in terms of my generation addressing these issues. We really believed that we could make fundamental structural changes in that wave of the women's movement and the work on violence against women that began or that sort of took off in the late 60s and 70s. We really thought that we could make those changes so that, Katie, your generation would not have to address these issues in the same way. That that was our goal, basically, that the next generation, you know, would not be faced in the same way. And, you know, we have not succeeded at that. But what I think from this perspective, looking back, that we can see is we've worked really hard to get from there to here. And we're now expecting the next generation and young women in leadership to pick this up and take it the next distance. But I think the lesson, and we were taught this lesson by the civil rights movement, but I think some of us weren't paying attention. But the notion that it will always be before us, that we can never take for granted any piece of this progress that we make. We have to be vigilant and defend it way into the future. And I think at this point in time, that's what's apparent. Don't take anything for granted. It's yours now, and you have to have some of the same fights that have already been had historically, but you're, I think, equipped and have a proud history of the resistance that has come before you to pick up and run with. So go for it.
Thank you.
Anything else, Sandra? Sure.
I think that's it. I want to thank everybody for joining us. This was a great conversation. There are some articles that we kind of referenced throughout the presentation, and I'll send along the PowerPoint, and Katie, I will add contact information. I meant to include your website so people can get in touch with you. Our next book, probably somewhere near the end of the year, is going to be Trauma Stewardship: An Everyday Guide to Caring for Others while caring for others. It's a wonderful book, and I know that it's a great favorite with a lot of advocates because, boy, do we need it. So we will be in touch with you about when we schedule that. And, oh, one last thing. Save the date, November 16th. In Boston, Massachusetts. Katie, I don't know if you're going to AAR this year, but we're doing a multi-faith panel in honor of Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune's 40 years of work. And
And Faith Trust's 40 years.
And yes, yeah, us too.
Yay!
Yay! So there's more information on our website. We would love for people to show up and join us for that because it should be really fabulous. So that's it.
Great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes.
It was great to talk to you.
Bye.
Bye, Elena. Bye, Katie. Bye, Marie.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.